Yeah, I'm Mike Ross. I've been here. I came to South Florida in 1988 to work for the Audubon Society in the Keys, and that's my initial experience was Keys specific. I worked in the pine forest in the lower Keys, and then in 1993 I moved up to FIU, and that's where I've been ever since. And I have some projects going on in Pine Rocklands in Everglades Park. Um, I'm a forestry guy, so when I see, Pine Rocklands, to me, it's a forest, not a savanna necessarily. And those are like two different ways of looking at the Pine Rocklands. You can have patches in the forest that have the species that Jennifer was talking about, I hope, and rather than a completely open pine rockland. And there should be both of them. So that's part of my message today. So we're talking about rocklands, and we do have pine forests in South Florida that are not rocklands, but here we're talking about pine rocklands. So the idea that pine rocklands are alternative stable states makes total sense because the succession in the pine rockland is to hardwood hammock, and it changes the fuel dynamics, and therefore it tends to stabilize in whichever condition you're in. And so hardwood fuels are flat on the ground. The leaf moisture content is higher. They don't want to burn. The pine rocklands, the needles are draped over other plants, and the litter layer builds up, and it needs fire in order to have that open understory. So I think there's a balance there. The pine rocklands, what's special? How would you characterize them? It does have an relatively open canopy compared to the hardwood hammocks. If you've gone in the hardwood hammocks in the Keys, it's a dark place. There's many, many species of trees, and I find it kind of amazing. And but pine rocklands are much more open. They have plants with storage organs underground, and therefore that respond rapidly after fire. Early after fire, you have a lot of nitrogen fixing plants that come in because nitrogen is limited in pine rocklands, and they have the capacity to have multi-age stands, I think, and that's one of the things I think we want to manage for. If you have multi-age stands, within a stand or across the landscape, you have more resiliency to the disturbances that happen, which are not just fires, they're also hurricanes, and we've seen that. Okay. And we have three very different areas of pine forest. We have pine rocklands in Miami-Dade County. Jennifer just said this. We have which are fragmented by urban development. They have different capacity. The ease of burning in those is difficult because of what's surrounding them, and they have different issues. In the Keys, it's nice that you could make a fire in the Keys because it's not so highly developed, but there's really only pine rockland on one island in the Keys. That's Big Pine Key. And then Long Pine Key is some in Everglades Park is something that can be managed as a larger landscape of pine rockland. Okay, so this figure is from Sugarloaf Key, and it's basically the point is that pine rocklands somehow are dependent on fresh water. Slash pine, variety densa, needs to have fresh groundwater. And so you can see in this figure the coloring on the soil surface below shows fresh water under the pine forest and under the hammock on one side, and then salt water on the side. As the first thing that I encountered when I started to work in the Lower Keys was my assistant, who had lived there for many years, pointed out these dead pine trees, pine snags in the distance, and we looked at aerial photos, and we found that on Sugarloaf Key, the pine forest had contracted tremendously, and then after Hurricane Wilma put water over the pine forest, salt water over the pine forest for a month or so, the pine forest on Sugarloaf Key was gone. And so there's still pine forest on Big Pine Key. There's a few pine trees here and there on some other islands, but it used to be much more widespread. The seasonality of fire, this is a slide of Jim Snyder's, and the lightning fire, as you can see here, lightning fires occur in the dry season. But the total most fires are human origin that we have, and they're mostly during earlier in the dry season. So they're not in the lightning season, where there's an idea that it's more natural conditions to burn when lightning used to burn. And but so far, I haven't seen any real biological consequence of burning in the lightning season versus burning earlier in the year, when it's much easier to get staff and much easier to actually be within the fire criteria that you have to be in order to have a fire. And so season is an issue, and it may be an important issue, but we don't know enough about it. Oh, okay. But this we do know about, and this comes from Dr. Bill Robertson, who basically said that we don't know what the fire frequency was, hundreds of years ago. But what we do know is we have this understory plant matrix there, and the length of time it takes for those plants to disappear is about 10 years, and he shows it here. And therefore, it tells us that we need to burn within that kind of window, and that's the best we know about the fire frequency historically. And so frequency of fire is, I think, more important than seasonality, at least with the data that we have now. We did a little bit of work in, Pablo Ruiz and I did a little bit of work after Hurricane Andrew at Pine Island in Everglades Park. And you can see the gray, it was a fairly dense canopy in prior to the hurricane. And by the time we finished, there were much fewer trees. And you see there's no young trees in that forest. We were tracking seedling regeneration and how they were affected by a couple of prescribed fires, relatively mild prescribed fires that went through there. And it's pretty clear that you can't build the next cohort of pine trees unless at some point in time you leave the stand to not burn for more than 5 years. That's how long, if you get regeneration rapidly enough and they can grow to a half meter or even a meter, then you might have a new cohort of pines. And so finally, I think, what are the management objectives that we could have for pine forest? And this is what I immediately came to my mind. One thing is the vulnerability of adjacent lands to wildfire. Miami-Dade County, that's in a wildland-urban interface, that's extremely important. The biodiversity, the plant diversity, and the animal diversity is another benefit that we're trying to have from the Pine Rocklands. But the third thing has to do with forest structure and resilience to disturbance. So at some point in time during the life of a stand, thinking landscape wide, you may need to develop the next cohort so that you have a multi-age structure in your forest and in individual stands. And that's what I have. Thank you.